Black woman humiliated at a traffic stop. The shock when her identity was revealed. It was one of those evenings that felt heavier than usual. The cold air seeped through the gaps in the car's window sills, and Monica could feel it biting at her fingertips as she gripped the steering wheel. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows on the nearly empty road ahead, their glow a reminder of how late it had gotten. She was finally heading home after a day that had pushed her to her limits. But she wasn't complaining. Her body ached from sitting too long at her desk, her shoulders stiff from tension, but none of it dimmed the flicker of pride that warmed her chest. Monica had closed a major deal earlier that day, one that cemented her reputation as a rising star in her field. Sure, the grind was exhausting, but it was paying off. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires against the asphalt almost lulled her into a trance, offering a sense of calm she rarely felt. For once, the world seemed quiet, like it was giving her a moment to breathe after weeks of chaos. And then it happened. Flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror, slicing through the darkness like a blade. Her stomach dropped. A police checkpoint. She hadn't expected this stretch of road, usually so uneventful, to turn into the stage for what would be one of the most unforgettable nights of her life. She let out a small sigh and adjusted her seatbelt with steady hands, forcing herself to stay composed. Probably just a routine stop, she murmured under her breath, more for her own reassurance than anything else. But as the officers approached her car, their footsteps deliberate and their stares sharper than the cold, something shifted in the air. Monica's fingers tightened around the wheel instinctively. The way they looked at her, it wasn't just routine. It wasn't just caution. It was something she'd felt too many times before. But each time, it stung as if it were the first. Her calm facade began to waver, just slightly. Her thoughts raced. Was it the car? The time of night? Or was it me? The question lingered, unspoken but loud in her mind, as the figures in uniform drew closer. She wasn't sure what was about to unfold, but deep down, Monica knew this encounter would be anything but ordinary. The tap on the glass startled her, even though she'd been watching the officer approach in her side mirror. His face was set, his expression unreadable except for a hint of severity in his eyes. Monica rolled down the window, the chill of the night sweeping in like a silent warning. "Good evening, ma'am. License and registration, please," the officer said, his voice low and clipped, more command than greeting. His name tag read Grant, but there was no trace of friendliness or humanity in his tone. Monica nodded politely and reached into the glove compartment for her documents. Every movement was deliberate, careful, as if the slightest sudden gesture could ignite an invisible spark. She handed him her license and registration with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. "Here you go, officer," she said, her voice steady but not overly polite. She'd learned over the years that too much deference could sometimes be read as guilt. Grant took the papers, but didn't thank her or even acknowledge her cooperation. Instead, his gaze flicked between the documents and her face, as if he were trying to match a mugshot to a crime. The seconds stretched painfully long. The air felt thicker now, pressing down on her like a weight. Monica could hear faint murmurs from the other officers nearby, and the occasional crunch of their boots against the gravel as they moved around her car. She resisted the urge to glance back, keeping her focus forward, her hands loosely gripping the steering wheel. Grant finally handed the documents off to a younger officer standing nearby and took a step closer to her window. His expression had shifted. It wasn't blank anymore. It was calculating. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. Monica blinked, her composure momentarily cracking. "Excuse me, is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to mask the confusion and unease creeping into her tone. His response came quick, curt, and entirely devoid of explanation. "Suspicious behavior. Suspicious behavior." Monica's mind raced, trying to process his words. Her car was spotless, her outfit professional, a fitted blazer over a sleek blouse, paired with modest heels. She wasn't speeding, hadn't been swerving, hadn't broken any laws. What was suspicious about her? But she knew. Deep down, she knew. The script was painfully familiar. It was the way they lingered too long on her skin tone, the way their eyes shifted from her face to the car like they were searching for evidence that didn't exist. Her stomach tightened, but her face betrayed nothing. Compliance was her best and only option right now. With a measured breath, she unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. The cold night air hit her immediately, sharp and biting against her skin. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she stepped out, the sound echoing louder than she intended. She stood beside the car, her back straight, her hands visible, every movement controlled. She could feel the weight of their stares, Grant's, the younger officers, even the others lingering in the shadows. The chill in the air was nothing compared to the one she felt radiating from the men around her. Stay calm. Keep breathing. Don't let them see you falter. Her mind screamed with questions, but she kept her lips pressed tightly together. Asking why wouldn't change anything. These men had already decided who they thought she was. As she waited, her breath visible in the freezing air, Monica couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a routine stop. Monica stood beside her car, the cold pavement beneath her heels, grounding her as her breath formed faint clouds in the air. She kept her hands visible, fingers loosely intertwined in front of her. Years of experience had taught her this. Remain calm, stay composed, don't give them an excuse to escalate. Behind her, Officer Grant had already opened her bag and was rifling through it with an invasive casualness, like he had every right to be there. No explanations, no requests for permission, just entitled motions that made her blood simmer beneath her calm exterior. A second officer, older but no less imposing, leaned against the side of her car, his arms crossed as he observed her. His gaze wasn't neutral. It was heavy, calculated, and filled with silent judgment. It felt as though he was peeling back layers, searching for cracks that didn't exist. Then came the younger one, Officer Eric. His energy was different, edgy, cocky, the kind of arrogance that came with inexperience, but carried the sting of unchecked authority. He stepped closer, just enough to make his presence feel invasive. His voice sliced through the tension like a dull blade, irritating and unrelenting. "What's someone like you doing around here at this time of night?" he sneered, his tone dripping with condescension. Monica's fingers tightened imperceptibly, but her face betrayed nothing. She met his eyes with a steady gaze, refusing to give him the reaction he seemed so desperate to provoke. "I'm just heading home from work," she replied, her tone even and measured, as if she were explaining something mundane to a child. But Eric wasn't interested in her answer. He was interested in control. "Yeah, right," he scoffed, his lips curling into a smirk as his voice rose just enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Looks like you've got something to hide." The words hung in the air like a challenge, daring her to fight back. Monica glanced around, noting the subtle shift in her surroundings. People were starting to notice the scene. Passers-by slowed their steps, some pulling out their phones while others exchanged hushed whispers. Their curiosity fed the tension like gasoline on a flickering flame. Monica felt the humiliation creeping up her spine, hot and relentless, wrapping itself around her composure. Her fists clenched behind her back where no one could see, her nails pressing into her palms as if to anchor her in the moment. She didn't let her face falter. Not yet. They were playing a game they didn't even know they were about to lose. Eric tilted his head, his smirk deepening as he crossed his arms. "So, what's in the bag? Drugs? Stolen goods? What are we gonna find in here, huh?" His voice was loud enough now to draw even more attention. Grant, still rummaging through her belongings, made a noise that could have been agreement or amusement. Monica's shoulders tensed, but her voice remained calm. "You won't find anything because there's nothing to find," she said, her words carrying the quiet confidence of someone who knew the truth. But Eric wasn't buying it. He leaned closer, his shadow casting over her as his voice dropped just slightly. "You know, it's always the ones who act innocent that have the most to hide." Monica exhaled slowly through her nose, her eyes steady on his. She wanted to say so much, to dismantle every false narrative he was building, but she knew better. Every word out of her mouth would be twisted, used against her. Instead, she let her silence speak for her. What Eric didn't realize What none of them seemed to grasp was that this wasn't just another traffic stop. They had no idea who they were dealing with. The humiliation clawed at her insides, but Monica reminded herself of what was coming. They thought they had power over her, but they didn't know the truth. Not yet. Stay cool. Keep breathing. They're about to learn the hard way. Just when Monica thought the situation had hit rock bottom, the low hum of an engine broke through the uneasy murmurs of the growing crowd. A sleek black car glided to a stop just a few feet from the scene, its glossy exterior catching the dim glow of the streetlights. The vehicle didn't belong there. It was too polished, too commanding, like a spotlight cutting through the fog of tension. The car door opened with a soft click, and a man stepped out, his silhouette striking against the dark backdrop of the city. He was tall, his frame confident and composed, dressed in a suit so sharp it seemed to challenge the chill in the air. Every detail of his appearance, from the immaculate cut of his jacket to the polished shine of his shoes, screamed authority. The faint sound of his footsteps echoed as he walked, each step deliberate, his presence drawing attention like gravity. The crowd, already curious about the commotion, shifted their focus to him. Conversations hushed, phones tilted to capture the new development, and even the officers froze momentarily. The man stopped just short of the scene, his eyes scanning it with a calm intensity that demanded answers. "Excuse me," he said, his tone cutting through the silence like a blade. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made everyone listen. "What exactly is going on here?" Officer Grant, who had been so assured moments ago, instinctively straightened his posture. His squared shoulders and defensive stance betrayed the slight tremor in his voice. "Just a routine check," he said, his words clipped and rehearsed. But his confidence faltered when the man's piercing gaze locked onto his, unwavering and unrelenting. The man tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable but brimming with an undercurrent of authority. "Routine?" he repeated, the single word heavy with skepticism. "Are you certain about that?" Grant hesitated, his composure beginning to crack under the scrutiny. His eyes darted briefly toward Monica, who stood silent but unshaken, then back to the man. "She seemed suspicious," he mumbled, his words losing the conviction they carried just minutes earlier. The tension in the air thickened, pressing down on everyone like a weight. The crowd leaned in, their anticipation palpable. The man's lips curved into a faint, knowing smirk, though it carried no humor. "Suspicious," he echoed, letting the word linger, almost as if savoring the absurdity of it. He turned his gaze to Monica, his eyes softening for a moment as if silently assuring her that the tide was about to turn. For the first time since the ordeal began, Monica allowed herself a slight smile, small, controlled, but filled with quiet confidence. She tilted her head toward Grant, her voice steady and calm as she broke her silence. "Why don't you take another look at those documents?" she suggested, the faintest edge of amusement coloring her tone. Her words were simple, but the power behind them was unmistakable. Grant's face tightened, his earlier bravado slipping further away. He glanced nervously at the younger officer, Eric, who now seemed just as unsure of the situation. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Grant reached for the papers he had hastily tossed aside earlier. The man in the suit crossed his arms, his stance calm but commanding, as if daring the officers to proceed. "You might want to read them carefully this time," he added, his voice steady and sharp as steel. The crowd, sensing that something significant was unfolding, shifted restlessly. Phones zoomed in, fingers hovered over record buttons, and whispers spread like wildfire. The moment stretched out, the weight of it hanging thick in the air. Monica stood still, her expression betraying nothing but quiet confidence. She could feel the shift coming, the inevitable moment when their assumptions would shatter like glass. The officers, oblivious to the storm they were about to walk into, had no idea they were playing a losing game. Grant's hands hovered over the papers, his fingers stiff as if they didn't want to obey. The confidence that once bolstered his every move was now noticeably absent. He squinted at the text, reading the details with an intensity that betrayed his growing unease. The moments stretched unbearably long, every passing second sharpening the tension that hung in the air like a drawn blade. Then he saw it. The name printed on the documents hit him like a freight train. Judge Monica Price. The color drained from his face, his confident posture crumbling into something far less assured. His hands trembled visibly, as if the papers themselves burned with the weight of his mistake. He stepped back, his boots scuffing the pavement awkwardly, his silence deafening. The man in the suit watched the unraveling with an air of quiet satisfaction, his smirk widening just enough to twist a knife. Judge Monica Price, he repeated, his voice loud enough for the crowd to catch every syllable. He took a deliberate step forward, leaning ever so slightly into Grant's personal space. You've been harassing a federal judge. How do you think that's going to look splashed across tomorrow's headlines? The crowd responded instantly. Gasps rippled through the gathering, punctuated by murmurs of disbelief and indignation. Phones, already raised to capture the scene, were now firmly fixed on Grant's pale face. Every angle, every expression, every moment was being immortalized. The whispers turned to quiet outrage, the people realizing the gravity of what they were witnessing. Grant's jaw worked as if searching for words, but nothing came. His younger counterpart, Eric, now stood frozen, the cocky grin wiped clean from his face. His wide eyes darted nervously between Monica, the man in the suit, and the onlookers. Monica finally moved, her heels clicking against the pavement as she took a measured step forward. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her very presence demanded attention. Her eyes locked onto Grant's, and he flinched, his hand still gripping her documents like a lifeline. You assumed I was guilty because of how I look, she said, her tone calm but laced with steel. Her words sliced through the quiet like a scalpel, precise and deliberate. Grant didn't respond, but his discomfort was palpable. The crowd, now emboldened, began murmuring louder, their indignation rising with every passing second. Monica's gaze shifted briefly to the crowd, her voice carrying just enough to reach them as well. Imagine how many people face this kind of treatment every day. People who don't have the voice, the power, or the position to fight back. How many of them walk away humiliated? How many of them don't walk away at all? Her words struck a chord, resonating deeply with those gathered around. A woman in the crowd muttered, "She's right," while another man shook his head in quiet agreement. The man in the suit, still standing like an immovable pillar of authority, crossed his arms. "You owe her more than just an apology," he said, his voice cutting through the officer's stunned silence. "And I guarantee this isn't over. The court of public opinion has a long memory." Grant looked as if he might collapse under the weight of the moment. His gaze dropped to the ground, unable to meet Monica's piercing eyes. Monica stepped even closer, the strength of her presence pressing down on everyone around her. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "This is about a system that allows this to happen, a system that you're upholding with every decision you make." Her words weren't just a reprimand, they were a declaration, a call to action for everyone watching. The crowd's energy shifted, their collective anger now pointed squarely at the officers who stood exposed under the glaring spotlight of accountability. Grant finally managed a weak, "We didn't know." But Monica cut him off with a sharp look. "No," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority and experience. "You didn't care to know." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the quiet clicks of phone cameras capturing every detail. The officers looked at one another, their once confident demeanor shattered into fragments of shame and fear. Monica took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening as she turned slightly toward the crowd. The camera stayed trained on her, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't just about her now. This was about every voice that had been silenced, every injustice that had gone unchallenged. And Monica Price wasn't about to let this moment slip away. The officers stood frozen, their earlier bravado now stripped away, leaving only the raw edges of embarrassment and regret. Grant, the one who had led this misguided display of authority, stammered as if searching for words to undo the damage. His usual composure, the one that came so easily when he thought he was in control, had been replaced by a nervous energy that made his hands twitch at his sides. We didn't mean any disrespect," he mumbled finally, his voice barely audible over the hum of the murmuring crowd. Monica tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable but unmistakably firm. Her silence lingered just long enough to make the officers squirm before she responded. "Disrespect," she repeated, her voice calm, but with an edge that cut deeper than any shout could. "That's not the issue here." She took a measured step forward, her gaze sweeping over Grant and the others, pinning them in place like a hawk watching prey. "The issue is bigger than your words or actions tonight. It's the bias, the profiling, the way you looked at me and made a decision, without evidence, without cause. And it stops now." Her words weren't loud, but they rang with a conviction that silenced even the faintest murmur in the crowd. The officers exchanged glances, their faces pale under the weight of her accusation. As if on cue, the faint rumble of engines heralded the arrival of news vans at the edge of the scene. Their bright lights cut through the dim street, illuminating Monica as reporters spilled out, microphones in hand and cameras already rolling. The crowd, now swelling in size, pressed closer, their energy shifting from quiet curiosity to vocal support. A chant began to ripple through the air, faint at first, but gaining strength with every voice that joined. Monica stood at the center, unflinching, her presence commanding every lens and every eye. She turned slowly to face the cameras, the bright lights casting a glow around her that made her seem larger than life. For the first time, Monica allowed her voice to rise, not in anger, but in resolute defiance. "This isn't just about me," she began, her words carrying the weight of every injustice she'd ever witnessed. "It's about everyone who's ever been judged unfairly for the color of their skin, for assumptions people make without a shred of evidence. It's about a system that allows bias to thrive unchecked, that lets people like me, people like us, be humiliated, harassed, or worse." Her words hit like a tidal wave, crashing over the crowd and leaving no one untouched. A man near the front nodded vigorously, his fist raised in silent agreement. A woman next to him wiped at her eyes, her phone still recording. And then the applause began. It started with a single clap, hesitant but determined, and quickly grew into a thunderous ovation that echoed off the buildings. People cheered, whistled, and raised their voices in solidarity, their support rippling through the street like a surge of electricity. Monica stood tall, her gaze steady as she took it all in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the collective frustration of a community that had been silenced too many times. She could feel their energy, their anger, their hope, all converging on this moment. Behind her, the officers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier authority reduced to mere shadows in the face of the growing tide of public outrage. Grant opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. What could he say now? Monica turned back to the officers, her voice steady and clear. "The time for excuses is over. The time for silence is over. Change starts here, tonight, with all of us." The crowd roared their agreement, their voices carrying her message far beyond the confines of the street. Monica knew this was just the beginning. The battle ahead would be long and arduous. But tonight, she'd ignited a flame that couldn't be extinguished. Monica stood at the epicenter of a moment that felt larger than life. The energy from the crowd, the glaring lights of the cameras, and the unyielding gaze of the public fueled her resolve. But as the cheers echoed around her, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over. It was just waking up. In the days that followed, Monica became the face of a movement she hadn't planned but fully embraced. Her speech from that night flooded social media, her words shared millions of times across platforms. "This is about justice, not just for one person, but for everyone," she had said, her voice as unwavering in the video as it had been in the moment. "Change starts here." And it did. City officials who had once ignored calls for reform were suddenly listening. Monica found herself in rooms she hadn't anticipated, sitting across from police chiefs, council members, and community leaders. Her presence demanded attention, not because of her title, but because of her story. She wasn't just a judge in a robe behind a bench anymore. She was a woman who had lived the injustice firsthand, who had stood in the cold under the weight of prejudice and refused to be broken. Monica's focus was razor-sharp. She pushed for mandatory bias training for officers, independent oversight committees for police conduct, and transparent protocols for community reporting. These weren't just ideas, they were demands, born from a system that had failed too many for too long. Accountability, she said during a televised panel discussion, her voice steady and unrelenting. It's not a buzzword. It's a promise. One we need to make and keep for every person who's ever been silenced, harassed, or worse. The ripple effect was undeniable. Grassroots organizations reached out, wanting to collaborate. Activists saw her as an ally, a bridge between the streets and the institutions they sought to reform. Journalists clamored for interviews, amplifying her message to audiences far beyond her city. As the officers involved faced disciplinary action, Monica didn't gloat. This wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. But she knew the real work went deeper than punishing individuals. It was about dismantling the structures that allowed those actions to happen in the first place. 1 week after the incident, Monica stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd that spanned the street and spilled onto neighboring blocks. The air was thick with determination, the banners and signs held high reflecting the faces of people who wanted the same thing. Change. You've made your voices heard, she said, scanning the sea of people before her. But this can't stop here. Justice isn't a moment, it's a movement. And every one of us has a role to play. The crowd erupted, their cheers reverberating through the buildings like a battle cry. But for Monica, the victory wasn't in the applause. It was in the promise of something better. As the chants continued to echo, she turned her gaze inward. She knew this fight wasn't just for the streets or the headlines. It was for the little girl she once was, the one who had been taught to keep her head down and play it safe. It was for the people who didn't have her platform, her voice, or her title, but who faced the same struggles every day. Months later, Monica stood in a community center packed with young people, her sleeves rolled up and her voice full of passion. "You are the future," she told them, her tone warm but firm. "And the future doesn't just happen, it's built. By you. By us. Together." The room filled with applause. But it was the quiet conversations afterward that mattered most. The boy who asked how he could get involved. The woman who wanted to share her own story. The mother who said, "You've given me hope for my kids." Monica walked away that evening knowing the impact she was making wasn't just measured in policies or headlines. It was in the lives she touched, the spark she ignited in others to fight for something better. And as she drove home that night, on a road much like the one where it all began, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. She hadn't asked to be the face of change, but she'd accepted it. Because the world didn't change on its own. It changed because people stood up, spoke out, and refused to back down. And Monica Price, she wasn't going anywhere.